Plugin of the week is the Softube Drawmer 1973. The Drummer 1973 is a multi-band. This is actually a hardware, an emulation of a hardware component. It's a multi-band limiter, compressor, excuse me, and it's 3 bands, right? So you have a low band, mid band, and a high band with crossover points. And this is actually a very, very cool emulation of the hardware with also some added features like MS control that you don't have with the original. Now, if you recently saw one of my videos and also follow Softube in general, you're probably familiar with the S73. And this is a stripped down version, basically, of what you have with the 1973. So that's the full version, and this is the cut back version. And what you had here was a series of settings that would allow you, if you're not familiar with working with multi-band processing, the ability to kind of bring in different basic characteristic sounds and mixing them in. And then you also have a wet-dry control and the ability to control, how much gain reduction. And then you can kind of dial something in a little bit quicker. I also showed you how you can stack these up in different ways to kind of add some of the different components and bring in some of the edge. And that's something that Softube recommends in terms of the usage. So from the basic component here, though, and let me just close this window for a second. What we have here is a very, very, very powerful limiter. Drawmer makes some amazing components. They were really originally founded in 1982 by Ivor Drawmer. That's his name. And I remember the first product that came out from them, which was really amazing, was the DS201 gate, which really revolutionized gate by just the most simple thing, having filters on the side chain. So when you actually keyed the signal in, you could actually control where the gating was happening, taking out the kick drum so that the snare would be the only thing that was triggering the snare gate, and you wouldn't have any kind of interference. And that made it a very powerful unit. And those filters sounded so good that there were cases where when we weren't using the gates, we would use the filters as a way of controlling just, for sonic purposes, just for sound. Really amazing. So to step a little bit farther in this, I'm just going to zoom in here a little bit, and we'll just kind of focus on the basic settings. So everything starts at the input sections. You have an input gain control and an output gain control. You also have a wet mix control over here at the output stage. What's very cool about this is that it can be operated in stereo. Now that's the original because you have one set of controls and it would be identical for the left and right side. On the plugin, though, you can operate in and adjust separately the mid and the side settings. So when you see it inside, you'll see that the knobs turn to a red color. They have a yellow color here when you're in mid mode, and then when you go to stereo, basically you have the identical control over both components. Now, as you work here, there are several things that occur. So let's just start by working with the different bands, and let's start with the crossover control. So you have a crossover control that goes from 50 hertz up to 1.3K. On this side, and then on the high crossover, 1K all the way up to 14K. That may go down lower. Actually, I'm not exactly sure about that. Yes, it does. All right, so that's 1K. It goes down lower. So you actually have some crossover points that seem like overlap. I'm not exactly sure how that works, but essentially what you have is 6 dB per octave crossovers that go between the different bands. You have separate thresholds for each band. You can mute, put on, or bypass any given band. So when you mute it, it's kind of like a collective way of taking out, I want to focus just on the mid band, so maybe I can focus the filters on that particular section, and then take those, and then bring them back in when I'm ready to go. So you have that ability. So you have the threshold, crossover, then you have your attack, release, and makeup gain for each individual band. Now, if you remember from the S73, there were 2 additional controls, or actually one, which was the air control, and this would add high frequency. Now, this is kind of an interesting thing because it's connected to the crossover point, and what it does is it adds high frequency energy in before you actually start the compression stages. So it's typical that in compressing high frequencies, if it starts to get excessive, depending upon where this control is, you have something that can help you to make up for that lost gain. But it is prior, so it's a high frequency boost that works based off of the crossover point, and it also is prior to the compression. And that's the basic way that that's set up. There's also on the bottom end There's also a feature called Big, and what this does is it's a roll-off for low frequencies, and what that does is it makes it so that when you, and it's exclusive to the low band, so this Air is exclusive to the high band, this Big is exclusive to the low band, but what it's doing is sort of the opposite. It's not adding low frequencies. What it's doing is just taking low frequencies away from the side chain, and this allows the low band to be a little bit more active, or to move a little bit more, so that you don't over compress in low frequencies, especially if you have a lot of low end energy from like a bass or like an 808 kick or something like that. It can maybe extend things a little bit longer than what you want. So the attack times range from 0.2 milliseconds, which is really short, all the way up to 50 milliseconds. So you have a pretty broad range there of attack times. And the release times can also be very fast. So as you're going down here, 0.08 seconds. So that's like 80 milliseconds. And then what you have is up to a second, and then it goes into 3 multi-stage modes here. So these are program-dependent releases, and each one is a 2-stage release. So on the fast setting, it'll range from 100 milliseconds to 500 milliseconds. If you go to a medium setting, it'll range from 300 milliseconds to 2 seconds. And if you go to the slow setting, it'll range from 500 milliseconds to 5 seconds. So depending upon what it is that you're doing, you may want to have very long release times. And a lot of vintage limiters would have this multi-stage release sometimes going on for broadcasts like 5, 10, 20 seconds on the release time. And so if you think like 5 seconds sounds really excessive, it's not, depending upon the program material that you're working with. So something that is perhaps, much more like maybe a classical piece that has like a little bit more sustain and expressiveness in it, and is not as dynamic or percussive, may suit you a little bit better. Or it may be also a way of doing a little bit more averaging of the gain. And there are some techniques that you could do that way in terms of setting this up. So as we work with this and adjust the settings, probably the primary thing that you want to start with is by setting your crossover points. And there are a couple of other features here. So I'm just going to kind of option click here to kind of bring them to their default positions of 200 and 2.5K. One of the features that I want to show you here, because it's relevant, is if I hold the shift key, what will happen is that you'll notice that I can adjust all 3 thresholds at the same time. And this is a feature that's going to come in really handy, because if you want to say make all of your attack times the same, they will all snap to that. Now I'm going to start in stereo mode, and then we can kind of play with it a little bit so I can give you a sense of how all of this kind of lays out. So if I start here, and let me just start maybe with something kind of like a medium attack here. Set up my song here. I'm going to take out the vocals here for a second, just so we can I can talk over a little bit of what I'm doing and not interfere with it. So basically, the way I'm going to start here, actually, I'm going to shift these guys into a 0 gain here, so I can follow the amount of gain over here. And let's just kind of do something that is pretty simple overall, and then I'll show you how to kind of adjust the band. So maybe I want to make something pump and breathe and be a little more aggressive. Now, one thing I didn't say, which is very important, is it's a FET compressor. So it's a 3-band FET compressor. So the most popular FET compressor, which stands for field effect transistors, is the 1176. And while this is not an 1176 clone by any stretch of the imagination, the one cool characteristic about that is the flexibility and accuracy in terms of the attack times and release times, and how much of a range that you have with them and how accurate you can make them. And that's kind of part of what makes this a really cool unit. All right, so let's start by driving a little signal in here, and let's see if I can set basically something up here that'll give us a little bit of pumping and breathing energy here. So I'm going to adjust my threshold down here. You can see my mid-band is driving a little bit sooner than the others. So what I'm going to do here is kind of adjust a little bit, even them out. now let's monitor this in and out. Now, if I want to make some aspects of this kind of pump a little bit more, I can also slow down. Like if I want that low end to cut through a little bit more cleanly, like maybe that attack is a little bit faster this, I would probably have to adjust the threshold here again. But I'm going to slow down the attack here on the low end. And what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to mute out my other two bands here. So I wanted this to drive a little bit more of kick and snare body, where that's kind of clipping a little bit of the snare energy. And I'm going to just to kind of pump a little bit more of the... This is going to pump a little bit more of the frequencies that are going to kind of cut through almost every speaker system, 400 to 4K. And let this deal a little bit more with some top energy. So I can bring this in. Notice the little fade in there. And maybe what I'll do here is kind of work a little bit of a faster attack. Let it sustain out a little bit more. And then kind of bring in some of the other bands. Usually takes a little bit of a second to adjust. I'm going to go with a faster release on that high end. All right, so I'm going to go back here, and now let's kind of A/B this in and out and see if I've made a mess of this or not. So you can hear how that kind of balances things out quite a bit. Now, if we wanted to extend this kind of to the next level, there's a couple of things that have been added in that are quite cool. One, which we're not going to demonstrate here, but it is very cool, is that you can actually key this externally, and that's something that's not true of the original. This may work in an example. For example, if you wanted to kind of help to make a mix sort of pump a little bit more with the kick drum, you could, and this is maybe not the perfect example for that, but you could bypass the other bands, set up a low band that focuses on that, and have the kick drum actually keying externally the low frequency pumping movement. And the whole idea of doing it from that perspective is that the full frequency kick drum is going to be more effective at working on the trigger, whereas this threshold is working on low frequency energy that exists within this low band. So when you work from the external, now it's focusing on that end of it. And so that's kind of an interesting way that may help you to kind of focus to get something like that to kind of drive a little bit more end. So I want it low end rather, and get it to pump more. And that's something that is unique to the software version, as is the mid side. Now, if I wanted to kind of take this out and work more or less, from a mid-side perspective, now what happens is the stereo settings have now translated over, so you can see that they're identical on the mid-side. Now, the thing is here is once I move over to mid-side mode, I need to stay in mid-side mode. So if I make some adjustments here and then I move back to stereo, it's going to go back to the mid settings for the side. So you need to be very conscious of that as you're kind of working with this. Now, when I work with the side components on this, really what I'm focusing on primarily in this case is the guitars, which are kind of driving a little bit more. So I could, if I wanted to, just to kind of play with this a little bit, is maybe to kind of drive that side energy a little bit more. So maybe I'll allow this to have, get down a little bit more on the guitars here. So I'll just lower the crossover frequency. So that's driving a little bit more here. Maybe I'll bypass the low frequency energy, and for the time being, the high frequency energy, I'm just going to bypass those on the side band. So if I go back to the mid band, you'll notice that those bands are active, and here on the sideband I'm making them inactive, and this will allow me to make a little bit more of an aggressive attempt at making those guitars breathe a little better. So that brings out a bit more of those. So if that's only mutes that for the side components. So if I wanted to, for example, kind of go here, I could mute, and now we'll only have the side energy. And now if I mute these two sidebands, so I can control the crossover frequencies for those two bands. Set these back to bypass so they're not really doing anything on there. Go back to the mids. So on the mid band, I can actually have this focused more on the snare energy. On the snare attack in particular. So I can now make adjustments for the mid and setting separately from the side setting. Be careful because it's easy to confuse and think that the side setting is on because it's lit, but the yellow is the mid. So you can see the switch there in the mid. So just be conscious of that. And then if I go to the side here, you'll see it switches to red. Not a lot of high frequency energy there. Went pretty far up high. See if I can get a little side. Not a lot there on the sides on the low frequencies either. So I'll just leave that bypassed on both sides. Maybe I'll leave this on to have that high frequency boost. So you can hear how like this opens up the mix now. So you can see how you can really, when you start focusing in on these different things in a mix, and you can use this just as well on stem processing for drums, on individual tracks. If you need to focus on, say, like an acoustic guitar and it's a bit boomy, you could get it so that the compression kicks in. Using different settings, you know, you can really play around a lot, especially with mixes on the program dependent thing. Like if you have like, this is not a finished mix, so this is just on the mix bus. And so here I'm probably being a lot more aggressive and maybe taking a different approach than I might for a mastering type of thing, where it might be more subtle or be more inclined to use the program dependent release so that it's more responsive to the overall arrangement and not really changing things overall. But you could see how when you get in, especially into the mid-side mode, how it just really opens up the power and the ability to kind of bring instruments out, or if you use it with faster attack times and longer release times, pull things back in within the different frequency ranges. And the ability to kind of focus in on the individual bands and kind of tie them into the areas that you want to separate within that field is very powerful. It's an amazing way to kind of make this work. It's a really cool tool. Very powerful and very dangerous. So you got to be careful, you know, out there when you're using it. But you could just kind of see that when you start stacking up attack and release times and all this sorts of stuff, you have to be pay very close attention to kind of what you're doing in the context of the mix. As a starting place, if you're not that familiar working with multi-band processing, usually a good starting place is keeping all your attack and release settings the same, and at least you're kind of getting, you know, working within the context of the overall track and then kind of making adjustments accordingly. But, you know, as you become more proficient at it, you can see how easy it is to kind of go in a little bit surgically and start to extract, pull things out, make them pump and breathe more, make them, you know, set back a little bit better. Very, very cool one. So there you go. There's a plugin of the week. Fun one. The Drawmer 1973, a 3-band stereo FET compressor released by Softube. Awesome emulation and a great plugin. That's the plugin of the week.